He was on his back in the rubble, and the ceiling was coming down in slow motion. The second blast had torn the last of the plaster from the beams, and now broken bricks, glass, and chalk dust fell in a thick, hissing curtain. Somewhere above him a man was screaming, the sound jagged and high in the throat, but the noise of the shelling swallowed it up and tore it into pieces. "Get back from the stairwell," someone shouted. "They're bringing the building down." I knew that voice. Sergeant Karpov. Which meant I wasn't dead. Not yet. My ears rang like there was a kettle boiling in my skull. The world was all gray dust and orange flashes and the smell of burned oil. I pushed myself up, boots slipping on a floor that wasn't really a floor anymore, just a smashed mix of bricks and splintered desks and shattered glass. Once this had been an office in the Krasny Arkhtyba factory administration block. Now it was just one more broken room in a broken city. I poured around until my fingers found my rifle. The wood stock was warm, almost alive. I pulled it close to my chest like a child clutching a toy in the middle of a nightmare. My left hand found the magazine pouch at my belt. 2 rounds. That was all I had left. 2 cartridges. Above us, on the floor we'd barricaded, the Germans were already in the corridor. We heard the clatter of boots, the harsh bark of shouted orders in German. They were too close for comfort, too close for artillery. This would be done with rifles and grenades and whatever else we had left. "Volkov." Karpov's voice cut through the dust. "You alive?" I coughed and tasted grit and blood. "Dear Sergeant." I wheezed. "Still here." "Good. You're taking Sokolov and Yuri across the courtyard. We're down to our last magazine up here. You bring ammo back, or we're finished." My mind snapped into focus. The courtyard. In daylight, it was a killing field, a rectangle of broken concrete and twisted metal between our block and the warehouse where the supply squad kept what little ammunition and food we had left. The Germans had it zeroed in from 3 directions. We'd already carried 2 boys back across that open space, both of them more holes than flesh. I looked toward the shattered window that opened onto the courtyard. Just a black jagged mouth now, with night beyond it and the orange flicker of fires dancing off drifting snow. Somewhere out there, across 20 meters of open, shell-churned ground, was a flight of broken steps down into the warehouse basement, and the ammunition crates that might mean the difference between living and not. "Sergeant," I said, forcing the words past a throat full of dust, "it's suicide." He appeared out of the haze, face gray with dirt, eyebrows and lashes white with frost. Only his eyes were alive, hard, bloodshot, and steady. "Everything in this city is suicide," he said evenly. "The question is whether you die for nothing or for something." The building shook again. Plaster dust rained down. A concrete chunk bounced off his helmet with a sharp crack. He didn't even flinch. From above came the sharp, stuttering roar of a German MP-40, then the deeper, slower answering bark of our own Pipisha. Someone shouted "grenade" in Russian, then there was another blast, closer this time, and bits of brick pinged off the walls and my helmet like hail. "We hold this stairwell," Karpov said quietly, almost conversationally. "If they take it, they reach the Volga. If they reach the Volga, this sector is lost. If this sector is lost," he didn't need to finish. I already knew the rest. If this sector was lost, the Germans could roll up the entire line along the riverbank. And if they did that, they'd throw what was left of us back into the Volga like so much trash and claim the city. 30 seconds, he said, glancing at his watch. "You have 30 seconds to decide which of you goes and who stays." He nodded at Sokolov and Yuri. Sokolov was the youngest in our squad, still with a narrow boy's face under the grime. Yuri had a bandage over one eye that hadn't been changed in 2 days. He smelled faintly of infection and cold sweat. "Sergeant," Sokolov started, voice shaking. "Silence," Karpov snapped. Then, more quietly, he looked at me. "Volkov, you're the senior. Decide." Another shell hit nearby. The floor bucked under us. Somewhere up the chain of command, far away on some dug-in riverbank HQ, someone might have been moving toy symbols across a map, tracing arrows and drawing neat lines. Here, in the real ruins of Stalingrad, my world shrank to 20 meters of open ground and two faces looking at me, waiting to hear which one I was sending into a hail of bullets. I looked at Sokolov, at Yuri, at the shattered window, at my hand, shaking slightly around the last 2 cartridges in my pouch. 30 seconds to decide who would live long enough to see tomorrow's sunrise over the frozen Volga, and who would be left face down in the snow, just another body in a city made of ruins and ghosts. In that moment, with dust drifting down like dirty snow and the mortar blasts shaking the bones of the building, it felt like the whole weight of Stalingrad rested on my tongue. I opened my mouth to speak. By the time I had to make that choice in the Krasny Oktyabr factory, I had already died twice, first as a son, then as a civilian. What was left of me in that stairwell was something else entirely, something the city had shaped out of hunger, smoke, and duty. My name is Ivan Volkov, 95th Rifle Division, 62nd Army, Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Before the war, I was just a mechanic in a tractor depot on the outskirts of Stalingrad. I knew gears, fuel lines, and busted axles better than I knew rifles. I could take apart an engine and lay its pieces out on a bench in a neat line, each one in the order I'd needed to put the whole working heart back together. The city itself was like that: engines, cranes, factories, rail yards, a machine laid along the western bank of the Volga. If you'd looked at a map before the war, you'd have seen it stretch like a long scar along the river, narrow and clinging to the water's edge. To the west, the land rose into rolling steppe where the wheat fields started, and beyond that, further than I'd ever been, lay the endless flatness of Russia. In the north were the big factories, the tractor plant, the Red October steel works, the Barricade gun factory. In the center, workers' districts and the city center with its big stone buildings and wide avenues. To the south, more factories, oil storage tanks, and the southern suburbs. The Volga itself was a wide, slow-moving band of steel-colored water that never seemed to hurry, even when the shells began to fall around it. On the maps they showed us later, after the war, the icons were neat: blue arrows for the German 6th Army, red arrows for our counterattacks, lines for the front along the railway, the ravines, the factories. On the aerial photographs, you could see the city as a pattern: rectangles for buildings, gray stretches for rubble, black patches where incendiaries had done their work. But back then I didn't see maps. I saw only streets I knew, tram lines I'd worked near, the factory chimneys that had been my horizon. I saw my mother's courtyard, the bakery where I used to stand in line for bread, the room I shared with my younger brother. When the Germans invaded in 1941, Stalingrad was still distant from the front. We heard about Minsk, Kiev, Smolensk, names of other people's disasters. At night, in the tractor depot, we stood around the radio, silent, listening to cracking voices talk about temporary withdrawals and tactical regrouping. We knew what that meant. The day the factory posted the mobilization list, my name was near the top. Factory workers were considered valuable for the repair battalions, they said. You'll be close to the machines, our foreman told us, trying to sound cheerful. Not in the worst of it. We believed him, because we wanted to. When I left, my mother pressed a small icon of St. Nicholas into my palm. Technically, that was frowned upon, but the commissar who handed out our rifles pretended not to see. He had his own amulet under his collar, a tiny, worn photo of his wife. "Just don't lose the rifle," he growled, slamming the Mosin Nagant into my hands. "The icon is your business. The rifle is mine." Training was brief and brutal. What they couldn't teach us with time, they taught us with shouting and repetition. How to strip and clean the rifle. How to crawl. How to throw a grenade without letting it slip back behind you. How to dig a trench in frozen ground. How to march until your feet went numb and you stopped feeling the blisters. We saw maps then. Big ones pinned to rough boards in drafty classrooms. Europe, the Soviet Union, the front lines. The German arrows pointed east, red and straight like spears. Our instructors tapped the map with canes and sticks. "Here," they said, pointing to the thin blue line of the Volga. "This is where they must not cross. This city, tap, tap, is named after Stalin himself. Lose it, and we lose more than a riverbank. We lose face. We lose the story." At the time, it sounded like propaganda. Later, standing in the ruins of that same city, I realized the story was all we had left. Stories are what survive when buildings don't. When I first saw Stalingrad again from the east bank of the Volga, it was already a different city from the one I'd left. Columns of smoke rose from the factories like new chimneys made of fire. The air over the skyline shimmered with heat and dust, even though the wind coming off the water felt cold enough to bite through a greatcoat. We were on the eastern bank, waiting to cross by barge, packed in among men with bandaged heads, men sleeping sitting up, men staring silently toward the flames on the far shore. A political officer stood up on a crate and unfurled a map, pointing with a gloved finger while a photographer snapped pictures. Later, someone would paste them into a newspaper or propaganda leaflet. "Here is the tractor factory," he said, though all we could see through the smoke were jagged silhouettes. "Here, the Red October works. Here is the Central Railway Station. You will go across and hold the city block by block, house by house, room by room. For every meter the fascist takes, he will pay with rivers of blood." We believed him, because by then we had heard the rumors. The Sixth Army was elite, Paulus's pride. They had taken Kiev, Kharkov, Rostov. Now they were here. Looking at those tiny lines and symbols on his crinkled map, I felt like I was staring at some mechanic sketch of a machine I was about to be fed into. You want to know who was there with me? In my squad, there were 8 of us when we first crossed the river. There was Sergeant Karpov, who had fought in Finland and didn't talk much about it. There was Yuri, older than the rest, who used to be a tram driver and whose stories always began with, "Before the war." There was Sokolov, barely old enough to shave, who had lied about his age to join. There was Mikhail, who carried the squad's only light machine gun and treated it like a beloved pet. There was Petya, who played the harmonica when he thought no one was listening. There were 2 more whose faces blur now when I try to picture them. War has a way of editing your memory, keeping some faces sharp and letting others fade like overexposed photographs. We were not heroes then. We were just men with rifles, boots full of holes, and a river to cross toward a city that was already half ruin, half inferno. If you had looked down from one of those German reconnaissance planes taking photographs that autumn, you might have seen our little barge pushing off from the east bank, just one more dark smudge in the wider picture. On the map, we were nothing, no symbols, no arrows. Just 8 men, already moving toward the moment when I would be forced to choose who to send into a courtyard of death. Crossing the Volga under fire is something you never forget. The river doesn't care who is winning or losing. It just keeps moving, slow and indifferent, carrying bits of ice and ash downstream while men kill each other on its banks. We boarded the barge just after midnight. The air was knife cold, and a mist hung over the water, lit from below by the fires in the city, orange and red bleeding through gray. The barge smelled of fuel, wet rope, and fear. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, holding onto rifles, helmets, icons, letters folded into tiny squares. No one spoke much. Voices carried on the water, and somewhere out there, German artillery crews were listening. "Volkov," Karpov said, his breath steaming in the dark, "you're from here. You know the streets." "I used to," I said. "They won't be the same now." He nodded once. That was enough. The engine coughed to life, a low chug-chug that we all winced at, as if the sound alone would attract shells. The barge eased away from the bank, and the east shore receded into the fog. Ahead, the city loomed, a jagged black shadow line against the burning sky. Every now and then, flares went up, turning the smoke a sickly white. Halfway across, the Germans woke up. The first shell hit the water 50 meters off our bow, sending up a column of spray and fragments. Men ducked instinctively, as if that would help. The second landed closer. The third screamed overhead and exploded somewhere behind us, on the east bank. Down, someone shouted, though there was nowhere to go. We crouched as low as we could, shoulders hunched, helmets almost touching. The barge rocked and shuddered as the wake from explosions slapped against its hull. I saw one of the barges to our left take a direct hit. It broke in half almost gracefully, like someone had snapped a twig across their knee. Men and crates and pieces of wood flew into the air, silhouetted black against the firelit sky for a split second before they vanished into the churning water. We all watched them disappear and then looked back at the city. No one said a word. By some luck or oversight, the Germans shifted their fire further upstream, and our barge slid into the lee of the riverbank. Shapes loomed above us, broken cranes, twisted girders, the stump of a bridge that went nowhere. We scraped up against the shore, and the ramp dropped with a harsh clang. Out! Out! Karpov bellowed. Move, Volkov, move! We ran off into Stalingrad. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the blood and rot people always talk about, that came later, when the dead had time to pile up, but the smell of burnt things. Wood, oil, rubber, fabric, food. Entire blocks had been turned into giant fireplaces. The air tasted like an exhaust pipe. We moved through streets that weren't streets anymore, just channels between mounds of debris. The buildings were torn open like cardboard boxes, their insides hanging out. Beds, chairs, smashed pictures, a piano with its strings exposed like ribs. In one square, the tram rails buckled up out of the cobblestones, twisted into loops and spirals by heat. Every now and then, someone would say, "I know this place," and then fall silent when they realized they didn't, not really. The city we'd known had been overlaid with a new one, made entirely of ruins. We were assigned to Chuikov's 62nd Army sector, the northern factories. The word came down, "You boys are going to Krasny Oktyabr." The Red October steel plant. I had seen it 100 times from a tram window. It had always seemed eternal, as immovable as the river. Now the Germans were in parts of it. They called what we did their Rattenkrieg, rat war. Street by street, building by building, room by room. Sometimes a single wall separated us from the enemy. Sometimes it was less than that, just a floor or ceiling. Our company took up positions in one of the administration buildings and a row of workshops near it. The line was a jagged, nonsense thing. On the maps in HQ, it was drawn with a neat grease pencil, but on the ground it meant this: one staircase was ours, but the room at the top of it was theirs. The warehouse on the corner was ours, but the courtyard beside it was no one's. The third floor was ours in the mornings, theirs by afternoon, ours again at night. The tension climbed every day, like a wire being wound tighter and tighter. We got used to the constant shelling the way you get used to the ticking of a clock. It was just part of the background. What made your stomach drop were the sudden silences, the moments when the artillery stopped and you knew the infantry were about to come. We lived underground most of the time. Cellars, basements, dugouts we hacked out of the frozen earth under the factory floors. The upper floors were just for fighting. No one slept up there unless they didn't wake up. Food came irregularly, if at all. A chunk of black bread. A ladle of watery soup. Sometimes, in the better days, a few dried fish that tasted more of salt than anything else. We learned to chew slowly and not think about tomorrow. Ammunition was like food, delivered across the river at night, carried through the ruins by runners who had to dodge shells and snipers and patrols. Those runners were worth 10 of us. If they made it, we could keep fighting. If they didn't, all the courage in the world wouldn't keep a rifle firing after its last bullet. We learned the shape of our little piece of the war in obsessive detail, how many steps up to the second floor landing, where the third stair creaked, where the wall had a hole you could fire through without exposing your head, which window frames were good for resting a rifle on, where the Germans liked to throw their grenades when they came. At night, when things were quiet enough, we'd press ourselves against the cold walls and listen. Sometimes we could hear them talking on the other side, German words leaking through the brick. Once, Sokolov swore he heard someone laughing. "Do they sound like us?" he whispered. "They're men," Yuri muttered. "They sound like men. That's the worst part." The days blurred together. Attack, counterattack, rubble, dust, sleep stolen in 5-minute bursts. The line shifted by meters, not kilometers. And all the time, the noose tightened. We heard that our troops outside the city were preparing some great counterstroke, something about encircling the Germans. That was for someone else, somewhere beyond the smoke. For us, there was only our building, our courtyard, our neighbors in the next ruin over who might be alive today and gone tomorrow. The night before the moment in the stairwell, our sector had been hit harder than usual. They brought up fresh troops, new tanks, more Stukas. They smashed our forward positions until there was almost nothing left. We fell back, meter by meter, into the administration building we now held. By dawn, we were down to half our strength. Mikhail and his machine gun had disappeared in a cloud of dust and brick fragments when a shell found the window he was firing from. Petya had been hit by shrapnel that came through the ceiling like a steel hailstorm. 2 others from another squad simply didn't return from a patrol. We were exhausted, deafened, numb. And then, sometime in the afternoon, the ammunition simply stopped coming. Some runner had died in some alley, some barge had been hit on the river, some supply officer had miscounted crates. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was this: by nightfall, every rifleman in our sector had half a magazine at best. Some had none. "Hold the building." The order came down from Chuikov's HQ, relayed by a breathless lieutenant with dust in his hair. No withdrawals. No retreat. Not one step back. We laughed at that, a short, bitter sound. Where would we retreat to? There was no more back. There was only the Volga. So we dug in, counted our cartridges, and waited for the next push. When it came like a storm. Shells hammered the upper floors until the windows were nothing but raw mouths. Mortars walked their explosions along the walls. Then the shelling stopped, and we heard the sound we had come to dread even more than the shriek of falling metal. German voices shouting, boots pounding through the rubble, the clatter of ladders being thrown up against broken balconies. "Positions!" Karpov yelled. We fell into place like parts of a gun locking together. And somewhere between the first grenades rolling down the corridor and the second floor catching fire, I found myself face to face with Karpov in that half-collapsed room, with Sokolov and Yuri behind me, the courtyard below us, and the warehouse across it full of the ammunition that could keep the stairwell from falling. 30 seconds, Karpov said, watch ticking. Decide. The wire of tension, wound tighter and tighter over all those days and nights, finally snapped. You like clear stories. Heroes and villains, courage and cowardice, sacrifice and survival in neat, labeled boxes. Real war doesn't work like that. Real war gives you a handful of impossible choices and watches which one you pick. Sergeant, I said, I'll go myself. The words surprised me as much as anyone. I hadn't planned to say them. They just came out, flat and simple. Karpov's eyes narrowed. Dust streaked his face in pale lines where sweat had cut through it. Another blast shook the ceiling. A chunk of masonry dropped between us with a heavy thud. No, he said. You're needed here. You know the building and the approaches. Then send Sokolov with Yuri, I snapped back. He's quick. Yuri can carry more. Sokolov's eyes went wide. Yuri just sighed, the sound of a man who had already lost too many arguments with fate. We don't have time for a debate, Karpov growled. We need that ammunition before they reach the stairwell. If they break through, we're all dead, and the river's wide open behind us. Understand? Another burst of German fire slashed across the upper floor, glass tinkling down like rain. We heard a scream cut off abruptly. 20 seconds now, maybe less. I looked at Sokolov. 18, maybe 19. His hands were shaking slightly on his rifle. He stared at me, trying to look brave, and I saw my younger brother's face for a heartbeat, frightened, stubborn, trusting. I looked at Yuri. The bandage over his eye was stained brown and stiff. He had 3 children somewhere beyond the smoke and snow, if they were still alive. He had told me once, in a quiet moment, that he would rather die here than go back to them as a cripple who couldn't work. "Comrade Sergeant," I said finally, my voice steady, "send me and Sokolov. 2 is enough to carry ammunition. Yuri stays. He's better on the defense than either of us." Karpov's jaw tightened. "I gave you the choice, Volkov, not the right to be a hero." "This isn't about heroism," I snapped. "I know the courtyard, remember? I used to walk through it every day. If anyone can find cover out there, it's me. And Sokolov is fast." Sokolov swallowed and nodded, a quick jerk of his head. Yuri started to protest, but Karpov cut him off. "Fine," he said. "Volkov, Sokolov, you go. No later than 5 minutes, with or without the ammunition. If you're not back by then, we assume you're gone and we fight with what we've got. Understood?" "Understood," I said. We pulled off anything that would slow us down, extra coats, spare kit, anything not essential. Sokolov stripped down to ammo pouches and rifle. I did the same. We kept only what we needed to sprint, shoot, and carry crates on the way back. I checked the 2 cartridges in my pouch again, feeling their blunt weight as if they were stones. Karpov grabbed my arm. "You come back," he said quietly, his voice suddenly not that of a sergeant but of a man. "Even if you have to crawl. Even if you have nothing in your hands." I nodded. We moved to the shattered window. The courtyard lay below, a white sheet of snow torn up by craters, streaked with black where fires had burned. A twisted cart lay on its side near the middle, one wheel slowly turning in the wind. The warehouse opposite was a low, squat building of brick and concrete. Its basement stairwell was a dark mouth cut into the wall, 15 meters from the nearest cover. Somewhere beyond the warehouse, a German machine gun was set up. Every now and then, it spat a short burst at the building, sweeping across the windows like a blind man's cane feeling for obstacles. "Wait for a barrage," I told Sokolov. "They'll throw smoke or drop a shell or 2. When their view's blocked, we run." "What if they don't?" he whispered. "Then we run anyway." I tried to smile. It probably looked more like a grimace. We didn't have to wait long. Another ripple of artillery landed just beyond the warehouse, kicking up snow, debris, and a sudden wall of smoke. The machine gun went silent for a heartbeat as the crew ducked. "Now," I hissed. We vaulted the sill and dropped into the courtyard. The snow bit into my ankles through the worn leather of my boots. Every breath burned my lungs. The world shrank to the line from the building behind me to the warehouse ahead, and the crunch of our boots on ice. 5 steps, 10 steps, 15. We bounced from crater to crater, using the torn-up ground as cover. Shards of brick crunched underfoot. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears over the distant roar of battle. Halfway across, the machine gun found us. The first burst stitched the snow to our left, throwing up little fountains. The second ran too wide. The third came in low and hungry, snapping past our legs. We both threw ourselves into the nearest shell hole, slamming into the frozen dirt at the bottom hard enough to knock the breath out of us. "Keep moving," I gasped. "Never stop in the open." We crawled up the opposite side of the crater and dove for the next. The gun kept probing, burst sweeping, searching. Glass tinkled somewhere behind us as stray rounds hit the building we'd just left. A mortar shell fell somewhere close. The blast punched the air out of my chest and showered us with snow and earth. My ears rang. When the roar faded, I realized I was lying on my side at the bottom of another crater, my fingers dug into the frozen ground like claws. Volkov. Sokolov's voice, hoarse and cracked. I'm here, I wheezed. We're close. He was right. The warehouse wall loomed above us now, rough brick cold under my gloved hand when I reached out to touch it. The stairwell was just a few meters away, a dark slot in the wall. One more sprint, I said. On 3. 1, 2. We didn't make it to 3. A grenade landed on the lip of the crater with a soft, almost polite thud. For a second, my brain didn't register it. It was just a dark egg-shaped lump in the snow. Then instinct kicked in. Down. I roared, grabbing Sokolov and dragging him deeper into the crater as far as it would go. We pressed ourselves into the dirt, trying to crawl inside the earth itself. The blast came like a hammer blow. Dirt, snow, and stone rained down. The shock smashed into my back and shoulders, slamming my face into the frozen ground. For a moment, there was nothing but white noise. When my hearing came back, everything was muffled, as if I'd been stuffed into a sack. My head rang. My mouth tasted of metal. Sokolov. I croaked. No answer. Panic flared in my chest. I groped around blindly until my fingers brushed fabric. I grabbed and pulled. Sokolov rolled toward me, limp. Come on, I muttered. Come on, come on. He groaned. Relief flooded me. Can you move? I shouted, too loud, my own voice echoing in my skull. My leg, he gasped. Shrapnel. I looked down. His left leg was twisted at an ugly angle. Blood stained the snow under his knee, spreading like spilled ink. The machine gun opened up again, rounds whacking into the crater's far side. A chunk of brick disintegrated inches from my head. The warehouse was right there. The stairwell was right there. Inside, I knew, were the crates of ammunition we needed. Without them, the stairwell would fall. With them, we might hold. But I could not carry both Sokolov and enough ammunition quickly enough. He was not a bag of flour. He was a man, half-conscious and wounded, his weight heavy and awkward. The clock in my head started ticking again. 30 seconds. Another 30 seconds. That seems to be my cursed number. I could drag him back the way we came, across the courtyard, under that searching machine gun. Maybe we'd both make it. Maybe we'd both die halfway, riddled with bullets, our bodies freezing where we fell. Or I could sprint the last few meters to the basement, load myself with ammo, and race back, leaving him here, alone in this hole, with the Germans close enough to throw grenades. The building behind us, the men inside, the stairwell, the river, the city, all of it hung on that choice. My hand went to my chest without thinking. I felt the shape of the little icon under my tunic, its edges worn smooth by fingers and sweat. You expect, perhaps, that I'll tell you I hesitated, that time slowed down, that the decision came like some thunderclap of revelation. It didn't. The truth is that the war had already trained me for this. Every day, we made smaller versions of this choice. Who gets the last cigarette? Who gets the last crust of bread? Who takes first watch? This was just the sharpest edge of the same blade. I leaned down, grabbed Sokolov by the collar, and pulled his face close to mine. I'm going to get the ammunition, I shouted into his good ear. I'll be back in 2 minutes. If I'm not, you crawl back toward the building, understand? Crawl, roll, drag yourself, I don't care how. Just move. His eyelashes were crusted with frozen tears. Don't leave me, he whispered. I'm not leaving you, I lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. I didn't know yet. I grabbed my rifle, checked the chamber, felt the 2 remaining rounds in my pouch like 2 accusing eyes. Then I took a breath, climbed the side of the crater, and ran for the stairwell. The machine gun barked again, chewing up the snow behind me. A bullet snapped so close to my head that I felt the air twist. I threw myself down the steps and into the dark. The basement smelled of oil, damp, and fear. Figures moved in the half-light, 2 supply men who stared at me like I'd just arrived from another planet. Ammunition. I gasped. 7.62, rifle. As much as you can carry. Now. They swore, scrambled, dragged open a crate. Cartridges gleamed in the dim light, brass and steel. We stuffed bandoliers, boxes, pouches. Pain flared in my left shoulder. I realized I'd taken a bit of shrapnel from the grenade without noticing. Another belt for the machine gun, I snapped. Hurry. They heaved a canvas belt box into my hands. It felt like it weighed as much as a child. I slung it over my shoulder, packed my pockets until they bulged, and turned back toward the stairwell. Are you insane? One of them shouted. You'll never make it back across. Watch me, I snarled. Up the steps, into the white glare of the courtyard. I ran like I have never run before or since. The weight of the ammunition pulled at my shoulders, dragged at my spine, tried to slam my boots into the ground. The machine gun spat again, the sound of flat, vicious tearing noise. Snow jumped in front of me, behind me, to my right. I zigzagged, leaped into a crater, scrambled out of it, sprinted again. Halfway, I slid into the crater where I'd left Sokolov. He was gone. For a moment, pure panic surged through me. Then I saw the furrow in the snow leading away from the crater, drag marks, smeared with blood, heading back toward our building. The idiot had listened. A shell burst somewhere to my left, showering me with snow. I grabbed my rifle tighter and threw myself forward, stumbling, half falling toward the doorway of our building. A figure appeared there, silhouetted against the darkness within. A familiar, broad-shouldered silhouette. Karpov. He dashed out into the open, grabbed the belt box from me mid-stride, and shoved me toward the entrance. Inside, he barked. They're on the second floor. We tumbled into the stairwell together, shells and bullets hammering the facade behind us. Someone slammed the door. The relative darkness and the stink of sweat, mud, and cordite wrapped around us like a blanket. Did you find him? I gasped. Sokolov. Karpov's eyes flicked toward the corner. There, on the floor by the wall, lay a bundled shape. Sokolov, pale as chalk, his leg wrapped in a makeshift tourniquet, breathing shallow but steady. Yuri knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder. You're late, Yuri grunted. Traffic, I panted. Above us, German voices shouted. A grenade rolled down the stairs with a clink. Get back, someone yelled. We flattened against the walls as the explosion shredded the air. Shrapnel sang past like angry bees. The stairwell filled with dust and smoke. When it cleared enough to see, Karpov shoved the belt box into Mikhail's replacement, a quiet boy from another company whose name I never properly learned. The boy snapped it into his light machine gun with hands that barely trembled. Now we hold, Karpov said, eyes hard, voice calm. No more running. We bought our bullets with blood. Let's make the fascists pay for every one. The Germans came down the stairs in a gray flood, shouting, firing, throwing grenades. We met them halfway up with bullets, shouts, curses, and the stubborn refusal to yield another meter. We had enough ammunition now. Enough to make my choice in the courtyard mean something. Enough to turn that stairwell into a wall of fire. I do not remember how many I shot that night. I remember only fragments, the kick of the rifle against my shoulder, the smell of burned powder, the way the muzzle flashes turned the dust into a golden storm. I remember Karpov shouting hoarse encouragements, Yuri firing short, precise bursts, the machine gun chattering like an angry god. Once, in a lull, I realized my 2 original cartridges were long gone. The pouches at my belt were full again. I had traded 2 bullets and a decision for crates of ammunition and a few more hours of life. By dawn, the stairs were still ours. So was the building. So was the river behind it. The Germans pulled back, leaving their dead and wounded in the corridors. We slumped against the walls, too tired even to speak. Sokolov was still alive. So was I. You expect the story to end there, perhaps, at the moment of victory. But Stalingrad did not end in a single night, or with the holding of one stairwell. It dragged on, week after week, month after month, grinding us down like stones in a river. After that night, we kept fighting in the same building for days. The front shifted around us like a living thing. The Germans took one workshop, we took it back, they shelled it flat, and then no one had it. Our positions became harder to describe even on maps. You couldn't draw lines for Stalingrad, only blotches and notes, resistance here, ruins, no man's land. In November, we started to hear rumors. Our boys outside the city, the ones we'd almost cursed for leaving us alone in the ruins, had finally moved. Operation Uranus, they called it. A grand name for what it meant in reality. The Germans were now trapped in their own pocket, encircled by red arrows on the map just as we had once been encircled by them in the streets. We didn't see the maps then. What we saw were little signs, fewer artillery shells landing on our positions, fewer fresh German units rotating into the line, more gaunt faces peering at us over shattered walls. Winter came in full. Snow crept into everything. Our greatcoats stiffened at night, our boots froze on our feet, our breath hung in the air in little clouds that seemed too small to hold all the life in our chests. Hunger was a constant. We chewed on blocks of frozen bread so hard it made our jaws ache. We boiled soup from whatever the quartermaster could scrounge. Once, we found a warehouse with sacks of grain that had been soaked by water. We scraped the mold off and ate it anyway. Our stomachs protested, but we were beyond caring. The Germans were starving too. You could see it in the way they moved, slower, more cautious. You could hear it in the way their shouting grew weaker. Once, in a rare pause in the fighting, someone shouted in broken Russian from the other side of the wall, asking if we would trade cigarettes for bread. No one answered. We were all trapped in that ruined city, both sides, like wolves in a pit. The Volga at our backs, the steppe around them. The only direction that promised any freedom at all was down, into the grave. In January, the end came in pieces. First, we heard that the German airfield at Gumrak had fallen, their last lifeline cut. Then we saw groups of prisoners shuffling past under guard, their uniforms in rags, their eyes hollow. These were not the invincible soldiers who had marched into the city with songs and banners. These were men who had learned, like we had, that maps lie and rivers do not. On February 2, 1943, the last pockets of resistance in the northern part of the city finally surrendered. Someone in HQ said the words out loud, "The Battle of Stalingrad is over." We didn't cheer. We were too tired for that. Instead, we sat in what remained of our building in the Red October complex and tried to understand what over meant. The stairwell was still there, more or less. The walls were chipped and pockmarked, the steps cracked, the railings twisted. The room where Karpov had first given me that impossible choice had lost half its roof. Snow drifted in, piling in the corners around piles of spent cartridges. Sokolov lay on a stretcher under a blanket. His leg was gone from the knee down. Infection had nearly taken him, but one of the surgeons in a makeshift hospital on the East Bank had fought like hell to keep him alive. "You saved me," he said once, looking at me with the kind of intensity that makes you want to look away. "No," I said. "You saved yourself. You crawled, remember?" He smiled faintly. "Because you told me to." I didn't argue. Some debts can't be balanced with words. Karpov died a week after the official end of the battle. Not from a bullet or a shell. From pneumonia. His body, worn down by months of cold and hunger, simply gave out. He went quietly, in his sleep, in a corner of the very basement we had defended together. We buried him in a shallow grave near the riverbank, under a pile of stones. There were no proper crosses or markers then, just a rough plank with his name burned into it with a bit of heated wire. "Comrade Sergeant," I said, standing over the mound, breath fogging in the air. "You held the line." That was all there was to say. After the war, the city changed again. Stalingrad became Volgograd. New buildings rose where the old ones had fallen. Parks bloomed where we had once scrambled for cover. Monuments appeared, great pillars, statues, plaques with long lists of names. Tourists came, eventually. They walked through the restored factory district with guides who pointed out where the front lines had been, where famous photographs had been taken, where heroic actions had taken place. They looked at maps on big boards, with arrows showing the flow of battle and shaded areas for encirclements. Sometimes, when my legs were still strong enough, I would go back to the old Red October site. One of the administration buildings remained as a kind of memorial, its shell preserved, its bullet holes intact. You could walk through it on guided tours. I remember once a young student with a camera around his neck looking at the stairwell, at the chipped steps and scarred walls. "It's smaller than I expected," he said to his friend. "All the books talk about these huge battles, but this, it's just a staircase." I wanted to tell him that he was both right and wrong. That yes, it was just a staircase, concrete, steel, stone. But it was also a battlefield, a border, a line that men had decided not to step back from, even when everything else was falling apart. In a museum nearby, there was a big map of the city as it had been in 1942, with lights you could press to see how the front line shifted day by day. People clustered around it, watching the little red and blue bulbs flicker. I stood there once, looking at the tiny dot marking the Krasny Oktyabr factory. It flickered as the days progressed, front moving, front holding, front pushing back. On that map, the night I ran across the courtyard was nothing. A single data point buried under things much larger than me: divisions, armies, operations. My decision in that crater didn't show up on any arrow. It lived only in my memory and in the scars on Sokolov's leg and in the dirt packed under Karpov's grave. You asked for a soldier's story from inside the ruins. Here it is, such as it is. No grand strategy, no speeches, no sweeping camera shots over frozen battlefields. Just one man in one stairwell, in one ruined building, in one city that refused to die. People like to say that we survived Stalingrad, as if the city was some kind of monster that tried to swallow us whole. The truth is more complicated. Stalingrad took parts of us, bit by bit, day by day, our friends, our innocence, our body strength. In return, it gave us something harder to name. I think, in the end, it gave us the knowledge that sometimes the only victory you can claim is to still be standing when the smoke clears. Not unbroken. Never that. Just standing. I am an old man now. My hands shake when I hold a cup, not a rifle. My lungs still remember the dust. I cough in winter like the city once did under bombardment. I keep the little icon my mother gave me on a shelf by the window. Its edges are still smooth from the pressure of my fingers all those years ago. Sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind rattles the glass, I close my eyes and I am back in that stairwell. I feel the weight of 2 cartridges in my pouch. I hear Karpov's voice, "You have 30 seconds to decide who lives." And I remember that in a courtyard between 2 ruined buildings, with a machine gun searching for my heartbeat, I chose to run toward danger with my hands outstretched, not because I wanted to be a hero, but because there was no one else to make the decision. If there is any meaning in survival, I think it lies there. Not in medals, not in monuments, not in lines on maps, but in those moments when you are given a choice that no one should have to make, and you make it anyway. The ruins of Stalingrad are mostly gone now, buried under concrete and glass and new stories. But somewhere, under the foundations of the modern city, under the tourist buses and the souvenir stands and the polished marble of memorial halls, the old stones remember. Stairs remember. Walls remember. And so do I.